Views expressed during Impact Café are those of the panelists and do not represent the views of Franklin Energy or AM Conservation Group. Welcome again to Impact Café, a podcast from Franklin Energy and AM Conservation Group that is dedicated to discussing all things related to energy innovation and impact in communities across North America. Our latest installment discusses transportation electrification, what utilities can do to support infrastructure, and where EV demand is expected to go from here. Developing widespread electrification is one of the most significant keys to building a sustainable future. Yet government officials, private organizations, and utilities alike are struggling to create a viable path towards establishing the infrastructure necessary for widespread electrification, including that of the vehicle industry. Today's episode features a great discussion between Scott Barrios of Entergy, Rishi Sondhi from National Grid, and April Bolduc of S-Curve Strategies, as they provide their own insights on the importance of establishing infrastructure, options for moving forward, and how recent success and failures will help chart a path to success. Enjoy the conversation.
Excited to welcome everybody to our Impact Cafe. I'm Jim Maddy. I'm the CEO of Franklin Energy and AM Conservation Group. I'm really excited to have a knowledgeable group of panelists to discuss EV infrastructure and different aspects of how to advance the EV economy. It's a really hot topic right now with states across the country trying to deal with varying levels of adoption. Certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution. We've seen makers, regulators, and private organizations, along with utilities, all struggling to create a viable path towards establishing the infrastructure necessary for widespread electrification. Although it's exciting to see continued news and progress, including Ford's announcement of an EV pickup truck, which I think I saw had about 50,000 pre-orders in the first 24 hours or so. So excited for the topic and excited to welcome this great group of panelists. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Marissa Uchin, our Chief Commercial Officer at Franklin, to take everybody through the discussion. Thank you all.
Super, thank you, Jim. Indeed, we have a great panel assembled today for an exciting topic. We are joined today by April Bolduc, Scott Barrios, and Rishi Sondhi. And I'll introduce each of them before we get underway. April is the founder and president of S-Curve Strategies, where she helps utilities build strong EV teams, develop strategic plans, and implement their EV customer experience efforts. She also works with state agencies to create DC fast charging corridors and strong EV policies. Prior to forming S-Curve Strategies, April led San Diego Gas and Electric's EV customer experience. Scott is the Senior Account Manager for Entergy's Electric Technology Program and the lead Electric Mobility Catalyst, I love that title, for Entergy's innovation hub called Keystring Labs. In these roles, Scott focuses on developing and delivering electrification solutions from industrial processes to transportation to meet the needs of customers. And prior to joining Entergy, he was a director of special projects with the U.S. Special Operations Command. He serves on the board of the executive board of the Louisiana Clean Fuels, which is a U.S. Clean Cities Coalition, and he is a member of the Environmental Affairs Committee with the Southwest Louisiana Economic Development Alliance. And Rishi Sondhi is the manager of clean transportation at National Grid, where he leads a team of product managers who develop offerings for residential customers. Rishi led the development of National Grid's electrification transportation filing in Massachusetts, serving also as an expert witness for the company. He's also served as part of the Alliance to Save Energy's 50 by 50 Transportation Commission. So I think this hour is going to go pretty quickly given this robust topic we have here. So I just wanted to remind the audience, if you have a question that you would like us to ask or at least consider, please use the chat feature. We will be monitoring it throughout and do our best to weave them into the discussion. So let's stage this conversation for just a moment. This year, ACEEE released their first ever state transportation electrification scorecard. And one clear takeaway is that there is definitely momentum, both on state policies as well as on utility planning and programs. For example, 23 states have comprehensive planning for more EVs and EV charging. 15 states have utility funding to spur EV and EV charging adoption. And 36 states have utility programs that offer lower electric rates for preferred times for EV charging at the level 2 charging level. Just a few examples of what we're seeing all around the country. And yet we know there's so much more to be done, and I think even many of the utilities who are joining us on the call today are probably just getting going. And so hopefully this conversation will enable us to share some learnings, some experiences that can help us all move this forward even quicker than we have historically. So Rishi, I'm going to ask the first question to you. National Grid has set forth its 80 by 50 plan. And within that, there's this Northeast 80 by 50 pathway, which definitely includes a focus on electrification, transportation electrification. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the goals are that are included in that pathway and how National Grid is progressing?
Yes, and thanks, Marissa, firstly, for this opportunity and to be on the panel. Really excited to be here today. The analysis that you're talking about was a few years old when we looked at the opportunity in the Northeast. And actually, I'm pleased to report that since then, we've actually increased that goal, and now it is a net zero goal by 2050, actually in line with the 3 states that we operate in, Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island, all have very aggressive net zero by 2050 goals. And so what does that mean for us? That means that we will have net zero emissions by 2050. That includes our own operations and the emissions that results from the sale of electricity and gas to our customers. So that's a pretty ambitious goal, and we've developed a framework to address that. That has 10 different strategies, things that you would expect, like energy efficiency, renewables, and decarbonizing our gas network. But importantly, clean transportation is one of them, and a big one at that. As you may know, transportation sector accounts for over 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the Northeast and in the states that we operate in. And so it is the largest sector and a critical one for us to target if we were to achieve these ambitious goals.
Super, that's very helpful. And yes, I think what you just shared about the goals being established and then maybe just within a couple of years, the bar is raised. And I think that's actually, I think what we need to really move things forward. Thanks for sharing that. April, for utilities that are just getting started in transportation electrification planning, what would you say are the top 2 or 3 things you think that they should keep in mind as they approach this?
Yeah, I would definitely say, especially as you heard, my background is customer experience, that keeping a positive customer experience the focus is probably my #1. And the reason for that is, if you think about at the end of your EV program implementation, you've taken a customer all the way through to the end, let's say even a fleet customer. That means that if they have a positive experience, that means that it was easy for them to learn about the program. It was easy for them to sign up for the program. It was easy for them to get all the approvals that they need. It was easy to go through permitting. It was easy to do construction. It was easy to teach their fleet managers how to, operate the equipment. The vehicles were available. So those are a lot of pieces that need to fall into place to ensure that the customer has a positive customer experience. So that's why that is so important. I would also say another one would be to keep it simple, especially when you are targeting your customers to sign up for your programs, and then also having them sign up for your programs. because I learned, the hard way that, there's a lot of things that us as a utility, we would want to do and know about our customer. And what we learned is there were things that they were getting hung up on, getting to yes. And we want the customer to get to yes really quickly, because now utilities are more turning into salespeople in a sense, instead of what we were used to doing traditionally. So we need to go out and find these customers. And then lastly, I would, think about the fact that with fleet customers, they need that white glove service. So advisory services are really key. Some utilities that I work with want to really decouple those advisory services. But if we want to be the resource, the EV resource for our customers, then we need to be able to have a really well-educated team that can help those customers through that process. And some utilities are implementing advisory services in that role, which I think is going to really benefit them exponentially. And again, that really gets back to that customer experience, because you want to get the customer to yes, and you want to have them move through your program pretty quickly. And then in the end, they will act as a testimonial for you. So.
Can I ask a question on this customer experience, which is really interesting? And as you pointed out, there are so many different touch points and places where that experience could be great or could fall down. Where are you finding in utilities, or how are you advising how that is managed? So who owns that in the utility, and how do they infuse that and make sure that these different parts of the utility are actually really helping to drive that forward, that everybody's on the same page?
Yeah, it's typically, in my experience, it's the EV team that owns it, but each of those parts touch many different departments. So you want to rely on the expertise of your internal departments. And so for me, it was about, okay, if I'm talking about developing, an application, or doing permitting, like those are two separate departments. So, really being in line with your public policy and your government affairs team can help you streamline permitting. And then really being in line with your customer programs, because they can help you target segments. So again, it's not expecting that the EV team has all the knowledge of the entire company, but leverage those experts in your company so that then you can put together a better program.
Scott, is that your experience at Entergy? Is that how you're approaching it as well? Or do you have anything to add to that from the customer experience perspective?
Absolutely, Marissa. From Entergy's perspective, and to back up what April said, in our innovation process, everything is done through a customer-centric lens. We want to approach everything we're doing with customer centricity at the heart of it. We're one of those utilities that you mentioned that we're very early in our stage, but we've been in the EV space for over 10 years now. Various different programs, not centrally synchronized. And that's something we've started in the past year plus, is synchronizing all our different efforts. What does the customer needs? And we're operating geographically in 4 different states, 5 different regulatory groups, or 7 different regulatory groups technically. So we have to make sure we can meet the customer needs in all those. And aligning internal resources to do that has been a big learning point for us. One thing that we did, so one big takeaway was, we always talk about education and outreach for customers, but we had to do that internally as well too. We had to develop an EV 101 curriculum that we shopped around, and I personally gave that to over 1,000 employees within engineering groups, customer service groups, key account groups, regulatory affairs, and every one of those has a different take on it. So it helped us understand, as we're building our own business plans, even developing that, what's important to those different groups, so we can best develop these programs for our customers.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue actually to the next topic that I wanted to touch on, which is around building that business case for EV programs, which is really. I mean, it's table stakes to be able to get through that process. So I'd love to hear from each of you, if you can share your experience of what's worked well about building that business case, both, as you were just saying, sort of, Scott, to get it through the internal approval, but then also to get it through the regulatory approval. Rishi, you had talked about, I kind of introduced you as having been an expert witness and leading the filing in Massachusetts. Maybe do you want to share what it took for you at least to get through your first successful filing?
Happy to. Yes. So, as you mentioned, Marissa, there's two aspects of it: the internal and the external side. So on the internal side, I think it's very helpful if the company has some overall objectives around net zero or other sustainability objectives that you can align with, because then it kind of fits in with that corporate principles. And that was easy for us because of our ambition in that space already. And then additionally, the ability to show that there is a market need for these programs, and develop something that will provide perhaps a profitable opportunity as well for the company. I think is all important points that go into that internal stakeholder engagement and buy-in. And then externally, I think it's also important to show the alignment with the state goals and how our proposals or our programs will specifically help the state achieve those goals. I think that's an important thing to show. And then related to that is stakeholder engagement. As you know, EVs are a hot topic, and there's several groups that are interested in utility programs and proposals. And what we've seen can be very helpful is getting that early engagement and almost a collaboration with the different stakeholders. So as we go into our filing process, we're going in with a lot of stakeholder support into the proceeding itself.
Right, just like you would do in a normal rate case, kind of build that support where you can. Yeah.
That's correct.
Scott, April, any other words of wisdom for what it takes to get through internal and regulatory approval?
Yeah, I think too, it's also understanding what your customer base is. So, for example, from a fleet standpoint, really knowing where your fleets are located, how many fleets that you have, because they are going to be your next big customer. And right now, it's interesting because, with every utility starting out a program, and especially a fleet electrification program, fleets are just not on the radar because they're not a large customer. And so it's kind of flipping that way that you think about that customer as to, okay, these are the next large customer, and where are they located, and really understanding, what your grid is like around those areas, because you'll probably find pretty quickly that there are some upgrades that need to be made. And I think when you start talking about it in that way, especially to your executives, even just pitching it internally, those types of that type of new information and this new customer base, I think, is really key to that understanding.
Yeah, and I'll add to that again. It all comes back to customer centricity here. The conversations that you need to build the cases, what type of rates do, let's say, a national company that's made goals they're going to electrify their fleet by X number of years. Well, they're working with 100 different utilities around the U.S. perhaps. So we're having those conversations with them. Okay, what do you desire from rate design? What do you desire from a line extension policy, perhaps? And taking those findings, going back and building that business case. This is what we're hearing directly from our customers. This is what's going to entice them, whether to come invest into our territory, to speed up that investment in our area, as well as going to the regulators. This is what we're hearing, and building that testimony for that potential rate case, and really keeping that customer at the center of everything, is what their desires want, to make sure we have a strong business case around that.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And it was,
Go ahead.
I heard a statistic too, that it's $1 billion a day is spent on oil, you know, and gasoline. And so when you translate that into, you know, our industry of electrification, I mean, that's a huge opportunity for us, you know, especially as utilities and as regulators, you know, to electrify. So, that's exciting.
Yeah, it is. That's a great statistic. I hadn't heard that one before. So then, just in general, what do we think is working well from a policy perspective to accelerate transportation electrification? Each of you, I mean, I think April, you work across perhaps more states than anyone here, but Scott, yeah, and Rishi, you both have your utilities operating in multiple jurisdictions. What seems to be working well on the policy side, whether regulatory or legislatively, that's moving things along in your states?
So where we're at in the Gulf Coast, you know, our state policies are, I think, are a little behind in some aspects. So one thing that recently just passed was the city of New Orleans just passed its renewable and clean energy portfolio just last week, in fact. So we're excited about that, and that's setting net zero by 2040 and complete zero by 2050, and that's with that the electrification to help in those offsets to gain momentum to help meet that 2040 goal. So it's good that it's all aligning a lot of these different entities, different stakeholders with the city. Now we're hoping the states come on board with that as well too. But we're excited about that initial step that the city of New Orleans is taking. So and on the national level, with all the new announcements coming out, it's starting to align states, cities to have these conversations that we've never had before. So it's good to have a unified voice there, both from the public and the private sector here. And that those policies that are becoming for people are starting to get ready for them now. Both I'll say both on the fleet side and let's say on the corridor infrastructure side for fast charging on interstates, people know that the infrastructure is coming. So we're having conversations with identifying those key stakeholders to prep that right now. And that's been very successful to at least begin those conversations. So when the policy comes out, we're not surprised by it and now scrambling to find the partnerships that we need.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Marissa, if I can add on a similar theme, and I think we have the benefit of operating in states that are very progressive with these policies. So I think the net zero announcements have been really positive and have sort of created a momentum in that direction in our jurisdiction. So I think that has been very helpful. And then one other thing that I'll point out is that, you know, sometimes these goals can seem too far out, right? 2050 is still a long time out. But I think what has been encouraging is other efforts to start operationalizing that goal and creating roadmaps. So as an example, you know, in Massachusetts, we have a 2030 plan that's being developed. And so they'll really make it sort of more urgent and present in terms of what strategies, what policies are needed now, so that the state is on the trajectory to meet those goals. So I think that has been very helpful because that really mobilizes action rather than, you know, pushing it out and saying, you know, 2050 is still a long way out.
Right, right. Yeah, April, I'm curious your perspective, operating in so many parts of the country, where you're seeing good examples of policy that are, even just to what Rishi just said, moving things along sooner rather than later.
And it's interesting because what's been, you know, really great for states that do have policies like the ZEV mandate can sometimes hinder states that don't have policies in maybe unforeseen ways. So a perfect example of that is states that have goals of the number of cars that they need to electrify, as well as emissions goals. And so what that means to automakers is that the only way for them to meet those emissions goals is for them to produce a vehicle that is zero emission. And so when you have states that don't have those types of policies, it can be more difficult for customers to find available electric vehicles in those states. And that's because the automakers, with the supply of electric vehicles that they have, are pushing those towards the states that actually have the policies so that they can meet their goals. So, hopefully eventually we'll have policies in all states. And I think that as you've seen, because the headlines tell the story, that's where automakers are going. Ford's going to be electrify all of their vehicles, Chevy, Volkswagen, you name it down the line. And it's exciting to see that. And especially that just follows right in line with now, what the potential federal policy will be.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking a little bit more on the programmatic side, I'm curious if you are finding, the focus on pilot programs versus full-scale programs to be, the way to get things going for your utilities, and why, sort of if you've taken an approach of one over the other.
I know that what I'm seeing is that all utilities start off with some type of a pilot program. However, some, I think, too, have been closer to, not just focusing on pilot programs, because you know how you can spend years and years and years doing a pilot program. I think now what you see utilities doing is really leveraging and looking at, for example, one roadmap that I helped to build for New York is, okay, what are all the other utilities doing, and what is the benchmark that's taking place now? Because then you can leverage those learnings either to help streamline your pilot or to help streamline your actual program.
Yeah, I think that is the beauty of this industry. There's so much collaboration and shared ideas, shared learning. EEI certainly brings together the utilities to do that, and many other organizations. So yeah, Scott, Rishi, curious your perspective. Have you kind of done the crawl, walk, run, pilot to full scale, or have you gone full scale out of the gate in any of your jurisdictions?
In different cases and different ones for us. I'm in the process of launching a pilot right now for a fleet electrification project. So for something like that, we're looking at piloting just because there's a lot of unknown still. And again, it goes back to when you look at EV adoption rates, our territory is behind the rest of the US. So the business case that we made to test it out is a pilot program initially launching. And again, we have to base that again on the different regulatory groups as well too, and their appetites for taking it. So where we're piloting at is where our regulators are more apt, have already expressed interest in some type of electric vehicle, electric transportation rate. So that's something that we're looking at and piloting those there first. Now we are going full scale on some other projects as well too on the public charging side. We in 2018 we filed a rate case with the city of New Orleans of investing in $500,000 in level 2 charging with the city. So we're about to launch that. What that's going to give us is 50 or so level 2 chargers around the city of New Orleans, with an express intent to go more and more. So we've already, again, I'll go back to the customer research. The pilot program, I guess, for that was, we've been deploying, donating level 2 chargers around the states and campuses for the past several years. But, this will be, in this one case, starting early next year, level 2 chargers will start going in the ground, owned by New Orleans on city property for free to be used for the public. So we're going fully invested into that case.
Interesting. How about you, Rishi, at National Grid?
Something similar, I would say, in the sense that, as it relates to the public charging infrastructure where we have the most experience, we are now scaling up all programs, and partly because that's kind of what's needed to achieve these ambitious goals. And we have sufficient experience there in deploying that infrastructure. So really going full scale there. And in some cases where, perhaps there's a new solution, new technology that we want to test, we are looking at some, sort of pilot or demonstration scale projects. So one example I'll bring up is, charging stations on utility poles, as a new idea. that addresses some unique customer needs, especially for drivers that may not have access to at-home parking, and so that can provide a really unique solution. So that's one we're looking to test out in more communities, but in others, whether it's public or workplace charging, that's an area where we have a lot of experience, and now we're just looking to scale that up, by a significant magnitude.
Yeah, I know in this industry, it's not uncommon for a regulator to want to see it proven out locally, even if it may have been done in many other places previously. Have you found a way, or would you give advice to any of your colleagues from the industry on the line of how to make the case to the regulator to be able to go full program and not have to test things out jurisdiction by jurisdiction?
That's a tough one, Marissa. I would say that it depends on the regulatory environment in each state. I would say where we've been successful is to kind of show our experience in other jurisdictions that we operate. So, we still have, so it's our team, and we may have experience in New York, for example, that we can bring to Massachusetts, and vice versa. And I think that has been, successful.
That's helpful. I'm curious, if you could share what's been a really key learning moment. Each of you has been working in this space now for a number of years, and I'm sure there have been a number of aha moments for you and for your utility in this journey to support electrification transportation. If you could share one or two of those learning moments, kind of an aha, to help the others on this webinar, just know, all right, don't waste your time here, or this was really useful, accelerate there. What would those be?
I would say one of the biggest learning moments for me was really seeing firsthand that transportation electrification programs have a higher customer touch point than other typical utility programs. And what I mean by that is working with the one customer, and it doesn't matter if you're installing in, a multifamily community, a workplace, or for fleet, because the technology is new, and then because you also need an external purchase of another piece of technology, which is the vehicle, to make the whole system work. Customers have a lot of questions about all of those pieces and parts. And so they, what typically you would explain to a customer, and they would, just go online and fill out the application and sign up. They're wanting you to have, 2 or 3 calls, come on for a site visit, once or twice, especially if you're working with the actual municipalities and helping them with their, for example, with their employees as well as their fleets. So understanding that there's going to be a lot more questions, because if you talk to the fleet owner, they need to get internal approvals for installation of charging as well. So what you would think would, maybe you've budgeted 3 months, in some cases can go 6 months, and in some cases, depending on the number of internal approvals required by that customer, can go as much as a year. So that's what I mean by number of touch points can significantly increase with transportation electrification programs. And so it's to prepare for that. And then how do you streamline your program is key.
I'll say the biggest aha moment for the utility is you got to practice as you preach. So April mentioned site assessments, going out to visit sites. Well, utility, if you're trying to convince a customer to electrify their fleet, you have to have electric vehicles in your own fleet. For a while we were operating, our customer outreach teams, not go and visit customers talking about electric vehicles or public charging, not going in electric vehicles. Customers take notice of that. The biggest aha moment of, when I got my electric vehicle a while back, and I went to do a survey on a customer site, and I pull up in my electric vehicle, the electrician, who's one of our consultants that we work with, engineering consultants on doing EV, specializes in EV infrastructure. He pulls up in his Tesla. our Clean Cities partner pulls up in their Tesla as well too. All three of us show up at the same time. The customer notices that. They take notice of that, and now they know you're serious about having those conversations about the benefits of electric vehicles.
How about for you, Rishi?
Yeah, Marissa, one thing I would add is that this is still an emerging market, still nascent, and market, customer needs are changing. So one thing that I think is critical, at least for us, is ability to have some flexibility in the program implementation. So reason I bring that up is sometimes we're required to provide exact targets, for example, for charging station by segments or things like that, which again I think are useful for planning purposes, but the actual demand might vary once we start implementation. So having the ability to be able to shift investment between segments, for example, and so if we're seeing more demand from retail locations, we can allocate more funding there compared to workplaces and other segments. So having that flexibility can really help us be nimble, especially if we're planning for programs that are 3 to 5 years duration.
And I'll tell you something too that Scott said, which is interesting because this literally came up with a utility that I'm working with. It just came up last week, and it's that point about I was doing a train the trainer. So this, Scott's done these internal trainings, so an EV 101, and you're training the utility employees really how to talk to customers about electric vehicles and their program, and none of them actually had an electric vehicle. And so they were a little bit nervous about doing the training because of course that's going to happen. Like no one expects that, everyone when you're starting off is an electric vehicle. But what you can do is you can go to your dealership, you can, ask your, ask the utility if they have at least one fleet electric vehicle. There are things that you can do to at least say, hey, I've driven one. And I know the excitement of it. Like I know the amazing, blow your hair back fast, so that you can at least talk intelligently about having had some experience with an electric vehicle is one way to mitigate that when your program is just off and you don't have employees that have electric vehicles. So we thought that was a good solution.
And I'll add to that too. The great thing about electrifying your own fleet, it's an internal pilot right there. The conversations we're having with our fleet services group, both from the vehicles, there's been some hard lessons learned, but also on the charging infrastructure. When we're designing charging infrastructure at various service centers, how to incorporate it into backup generation, which in our region is very important to have backup our vehicle fueling mechanisms packed up into power outage events. So we need the backup generation to support that. So our own fleet is our own lab for us to experiment with, learn lessons from, and take those learnings to customers as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's very well said. Scott, you and I were talking about some of the work that you've done on the dealership side. I'm curious, what's your perspective on the role utilities can play with the EV dealerships?
That's a great topic. Now I'll say that the dealership is, when you look at consumer buying electric vehicles, it's one of the main hindrance, right? Vehicle availability on site, acknowledgement of the sales staff there. Studies also show that the motivation for a local dealership to sell an electric vehicle is just not there. It takes twice as long to sell an electric vehicle than selling the comparable internal combustion engine. I test this out all the time. I visit a lot of dealerships. The conversations I had, let's say pre-COVID, a year and a half ago, I never had a positive experience, minus Porsche, Jaguar, dealerships like that you expect a certain level of salesperson knowledge. It wasn't until recently when I started going back out into dealerships, talking to Ford, Volkswagen, that it's been refreshing, the level of knowledge I'm seeing as a sales team. And they're looking at a utility to help train their sales team. That's the kind of impression that I'm getting. They're now because their manufacturers are saying, yes, we're going to go all electric by X date, and we're only going to manufacture cell electric. So now they realize, okay, we have to learn more about electric vehicles. So we prepare them for that. And one of the great ways we've been using to build that trust and relationship with the dealers is they have to install electric vehicle charging infrastructure at their dealership. So a utility, our role in utility to help them get ready for that charging infrastructure. For example, one major brand of a manufacturer, has dictated that all their dealerships will have, in this case, a mandatory of 5 electric vehicle charging stations. They can go up to 7. One of those has to be a 24 kW DC fast charger. The rest can be level 2, and even dictating specifically where they're at in the dealership. So they invited me, that brand invited me out to a couple different dealerships and walk through with them and talk about, okay, where can we best do this? Can we serve it as a utility as well too? What type of upgrades are going to be needed to service that? And it's developing that trust with them, and now they know they can lean on the utility to help them, gap that knowledge of about electric vehicles.
Yeah, that is. Go ahead, April, please.
I was going to say it's interesting because I talked to some utilities that say, oh well, it's not our job to be dealership salespeople. And it just gets back to the same thing that, we've been saying is it is in a sense because, and as Scott says, it's part of that customer experience. They're a key, cog wheel to ensuring that your customers have a positive experience, that when you're, promoting electric vehicles and you're asking them, to participate in, for example, a EV charging station rebate, that when they go to the dealership, that it's easy for them to actually purchase the car, and that the dealer isn't trying to talk them into having a gasoline vehicle. And I've done many trainings at dealerships, and what I found when we did one survey was interesting because the results came back completely different than I thought they were. And one of the questions on the survey was, would you like the training to be shorter? Was it just right, or would you like it to be longer? And 90% of them said they wish that it was longer. And the reason why is because they wanted to actually physically go out and look at the cars. And they also appreciated learning about electricity rates, because they didn't realize how easy it was when given the talking points to explain a utility rate. It was just something that they wouldn't touch before. They were really afraid of it. They didn't know how to communicate about it. So we can help dealers streamline this process. And again, that just adds to that customer experience, and it gets them to yes more quickly, meaning, yes, I'm going to go purchase an electric vehicle.
Yeah, so dealerships are an interesting element, I guess, if you were to think about a partnership ecosystem. What are other partners that the utility should be working with to accelerate successful transportation electrification?
I would definitely say that working with municipalities on streamlining permitting. What I found, especially in the territory that I was in for a utility, is that we had 29 jurisdictions within our territory, and we had 2 cities next to each other. One was charging, like $100 to install a charging station or to permit, and another was charging $1,000, just right next door. And the thing was, they just didn't know. So we did a survey of all of the municipalities within our territory, and we went to each of them, talking about it, and then provided them actual way to actually streamline that process. And so then we started seeing the cost of permits come down to install charging, and so that was really, I think, a key piece in helping to move that forward.
Rishi, Scott, have you built some partnership ecosystem to help with your planning?
Yeah, that is a critical piece, Marissa. If the programs have to be scaled up and really meet those goals, we need that ecosystem in place. And so in addition to the ones that we already spoke about, I'll mention a few more that we are working on, and one of them is charging station installers. So building that capability to really scale these installations, and it's also part of a workforce training, if you will, and getting those qualified installers at customer sites helps with the customer experience as well when these projects get done correctly. And now, as we look to enter the residential space to install EV chargers at home, there's another component of electrician training that needs to be done, and so that the next level of residential EV customers get that experience that is needed. In addition to that, we're also working closely with charging providers and OEMs, where again we've seen a lot of interest from OEMs as they look to promote their new vehicles. Those are just a few that I'll mention, and there's definitely others that need to be part of this ecosystem.
Yeah, I'll say everything that they said is an absolute. But another piece is advocacy groups. So nonprofits, groups that are trying to do the same thing you are, right? They're trying to promote fleet electrification. They're trying to promote EV adoption, enabling those groups to do their job. That's something we find very successful. Our Clean Cities Coalition partners have been very huge in our projects for us in all of our territories.
Yeah, and speaking about some of these stakeholders, another question that's come in, and I think it is really relevant, particularly with the current administration in Washington, and that is thinking about how you add equity into building out charging infrastructure, which certainly I would think a number of both partners and stakeholders really very much care about. Can you touch on how that is being factored into the charging infrastructure plans that you're putting forward?
Yeah, I think one of the key things around equity is focusing on transportation electrification as a whole, and not just from the standpoint of in order to participate in transportation electrification, you need to purchase a vehicle. So what are some of the ways that we can have transportation electrification for everyone, and that is the electrification of your city buses, electrification of school buses. So from just the use case perspective, that's really key. Ensuring that multifamily communities, for example, the city that I live in, 50% of our region is in multifamily communities. And so ensuring that, because it is more difficult to install charging in multifamily communities, but ensuring that there are ways that we can do that, and are ways that we can help facilitate that. So again, it's just a focus of transportation electrification as a whole, and that clean air is good for every neighborhood, I think is typically the approach that I like to take.
And I'll agree with April that the clean air aspect here is huge. And I'll give one example from electrification transportation. So we recently completed, they got their 10th bus this week, in fact, a small town electric buses for their transit. Now, this is a town right on the Gulf Coast. It's also home to the largest oil refinery in the United States. So they've electrified 10 of their transit buses, and the reason why we worked this with them is to provide clean air to the community, and that's what we're looking at as the equitable aspect of this, to ensure that there is whatever we can do to lower the emissions of that area. That's what we're striving to do. Now it gets difficult to public charging as well too. You can't just put chargers in areas where no one's going to use them. So you have to approach it from, it's a difficult business choice at this point. But we want to ensure that, once the secondhand market starts coming around for electric vehicles and there's more available at cheaper prices, that's what we really want to strive for, is equitable access to clean transportation, electric transportation, and they have easy access to charging as well too. Like April mentioned, multifamily units don't have necessarily dedicated parking spaces, so making sure we have the right policies in place at the state level or city level that will allow ease of permitting for that.
Yeah, and I'll agree with everything that was just said, but just kind of to add that equity is a big piece of our program design, is actually one of our guiding principles. And so our focus has been that any new offering that we produce should have an equity component in it. And so we're really operationalizing that guiding principle. And I would say that, while the first generation of the programs were really focused on, putting X number of charging stations in environmental justice community areas, and that obviously has benefits, but as it has been pointed out, there's other things that we can do. So just as an example, what we're doing, with the latest set of programs that we're looking to propose in Massachusetts, is that there's an equity angle, equity component in our residential offering. So even though the adoption may not be very high, we want to build programs that make it easy for all customers to participate, including customers that fall in either a low-income category or happen to be in an environmental justice community. And then finally, we know that not all of our customers have a personal vehicle or rely on a personal vehicle. So we are very much focused on fleet programs where, again, the benefit of those electrification can extend to obviously all customers, but especially to environmental justice communities or communities of color, which have been overburdened and underserved. So our programs include offerings like electrifying the public transit fleet, school buses, which again would operate in those communities. So that's part of our programs now. And again, hopefully you see that thread across all the programs that we are designing and now will be implementing.
Do you also think about rural versus more urban or suburban in your planning? Is the focus for now more around population centers, or is there a part of your plan and your programs supporting rural customer needs?
I would say in our case, the focus is definitely on the environmental justice communities, and some of them do have a pretty good overlap with the rural communities. So that's certainly one way that we can address it. And additionally, what we'll be doing is working with some of the stakeholders in identifying locations for public charging or for the electrification opportunities. So that's another way that we can target some of the communities through that stakeholder engagement.
Great. Scott, what about for Entergy? Certainly in your region, you or across your many states have definitely a significant rural area as you do, suburban and urban. Is there an element of your planning that is focused on rural?
Absolutely, yeah. So if we're looking at the corridors that move through our state, we're not only looking at the interstate systems that are moving a lot of people, connecting a lot of different communities, but from a rural perspective, again, one of the nuances of living on the Gulf Coast is supporting evacuations for hurricanes. We have to be able to support the rural communities that live right on the coast to get out of the way, to support mass evacuation events or mass outage events as well too. So we're looking at that, working with state entities and plannings on how we can support that from electric vehicle charging. So there is, again, it goes back to equitable access. So everyone who needs to leave the area they know that they have a place to charge at whichever, working with those plans for evacuation.
It's such an interesting perspective. I hadn't really thought about it, but it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, I think Entergy you are part of, is it like a Southern Corridor that was announced?
Yep.
More charging.
Correct. Yeah, we're one of the founding members of that, and National Grid actually just joined us a week or two ago, I believe.
That's correct.
And so what's the, why does the utility do that? I mean, you just gave a great case study, Scott, in terms of evacuation. What's the interest, what's the focus for utility to join these corridor coalitions for building out infrastructure?
One would be to, we look at the corridors are very wide, right? There's a lot of overlap maybe between various different utilities. So by joining this corridor, it gives us a planning mechanism to ensure we're using our resources the best available that way that we can. So as people are passing through corridor or interstates, highways, they have a place to charge. And the last thing we want to do is where one utility begins and one ends on, let's say, an interstate, there's not, chargers right next to each other. One day that might happen, but where resources are limited right now, let's plan the best way we can to space that infrastructure out to build confidence that people have when they're moving on that interstate, that corridor, they have a place to charge. So we've had great plannings so far, and we're working very well with our adjacent utilities, AEP, Southern Company, TVA as well, to make sure that we're looking at where we're all putting chargers and taking that in consideration. Plus, again, we mentioned this earlier. In this case, utilities are definitely sharing lessons learned. We're all in different stages of putting in charging infrastructure, and some have learned some hard lessons on what's working and what's not. So we're all sharing the lessons learned with that when it comes to the DC fast charging infrastructure.
And Rishi, oh yeah, go ahead, April.
I was just going to say another perfect example of that too is the West Coast Clean Corridor Transit Initiative, which focuses on fleets. So in that project, we got together all of the utilities along the West Coast, and it was to look at how could infrastructure then support heavy duty and medium duty electric transportation from the Canadian border down to the Mexican border. And it's really interesting because when you think about the significant load that these vehicles will be, needing, is, what needs to happen in this particular area if we space out charging every 50 miles or higher. Where exactly would we, need to upgrade, and then what does that look like? And getting a real understanding of what heavy duty and medium duty vehicles will need in order to support that whole transition. So it's great seeing the utilities getting together in these coalitions.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're just about out of time, but Rishi, I just wanted to give you a chance if you wanted to chime in on the corridor piece since National Grid just joined. I didn't want to cut you off there.
Yeah, no, I think Scott covered it, but I would just say that that's a critical element to bring in customer confidence, right? Because we know for EVs to be a primary vehicle, not the second car, customers need that certainty and confidence to be able to complete those long journeys, and initiatives like that, like this coalition, can really help do that, so that customers know that they will have access to reliable charging, for those journeys.
Perfect. Wow, I knew the hour would go fast. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Jim Matty to close us out. Thank you again.
Thank you, Marissa. Really well done as usual. And thank you to April, Scott, and Rishi for a very good conversation. I hope, as everybody can see, it's a really complex topic with a lot of moving parts. For me, as always in this industry, when we figure out ways to work together, then we can make things happen quicker, faster, better than if we kind of work separately and don't learn lessons as you guys just described. So thank you all very much. I hope everybody has a happy and safe Memorial Holiday weekend. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Impact Café. Franklin Energy delivers more than 100 turnkey energy efficiency and grid optimization programs for utility partners across North America. We work alongside our sister company, AM Conservation Group, who manufactures and supplies more than 300 energy efficiency and water conservation products. We help our energy partners achieve their goals with solutions implemented by more than 1,300 energy experts. Watch out for our next Impact Cafe to join our ongoing conversation. To make sure you're always a part of the conversation, follow Franklin Energy on LinkedIn and Twitter for updates. See you at the next Impact Cafe.